So I'm Zap. I run membership at the EC, really just today handling the tech stuff. So anyone who's not speaking, obviously please mute yourself, but because we're a small group, you're welcome to keep your camera on. And then throughout the conversation, I would love for this to be as interactive as possible because I think this topic is so large, but there is so many different takeaways, and we have obviously fabulous panelists joining us today. So feel free to chat anything in, whether it be to everyone, or if you're nervous, you could chat it to me or John Murdock, who's kind of moderating the panel directly. And then other than that, this will be recorded, so we'll be sharing this afterwards on YouTube and on our website. But I'll hand it off to Jane to give a welcome.
Yes, thank you. And I do want to say thank you to Zap, who has really stepped up and has worked to put together these webinars and listening to our members and our program participants and also the entrepreneurs in our community. What are the topics and things that they want to hear about? And then going out and we're asking people to participate. And thank you to everyone that said yes. And we have an amazing panel put together and very appreciative of your time and your expertise. You know, when we look at the EC, that was the original foundation, is for successful business people and entrepreneurs to give their time and experience and money to help the next generation. And, you know, in this pandemic that we're living in, so many of you have stepped up and stepped forward to help. And so we're very, very appreciative of that. With that, I appreciate John Murdock stepping in to moderate. And then all of you out there in our entrepreneurial community, know that we're here for you. We're listening, and we want to continue to be a resource to help you through these times. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Yeah. Hi, friends. John Murdock, CPO, COO of the Nashville Entrepreneur Center. Grateful to be here and to have this esteemed panel today. As we do go through the process, the primary audience will be those of you that are actually here. So as you send in questions, we will give those priority to the panel. And also, I would emphasize that one of the reasons we're doing this panel is that this topic was relevant pre-COVID and is also relevant today, and was one of our most most positively reviewed panels that we've done for an entrepreneurial program in the past. And so we'd like to be able to have a unique experience here, but capture it on video and utilize it with the entrepreneurs. So as we go through this, panelists, think about the entrepreneurs that you've already advised at the EC in the room, as well as you kind of think about who it is that's your target audience as we ask these questions and share information. And please feel free not to feel too formal or stuck to just my questions. If there are stories, topics, or issues that you as a panelist want to bring up, you know, share them. We want this to be engaging, informative, and useful. All done, Zap.
Oh, awesome. There's nothing more that I need to add, I suppose.
Oh, cool.
No worries.
So then, I guess we're ready to go ahead and start. I see some names still kind of clicking in, but I'll let them catch up as we go. That work for you, Zap?
Yes, it does. And we started recording, so we're good on that.
Yep, gotcha. Cool. So then our request is, would our esteemed panelists, each of you here, just take 1 minute to introduce yourself and give people a bit of a background on who you are and what brings you here today. And we'll start with Yvonne.
I knew that was going to be the first one up. Yvonne Sullivan. I have been a mentor at the Entrepreneur Center for about 6 years now. My background is in research and investment banking. I was head of fixed income research at LaSalle Bank in Chicago, who was also owned by ABN AMRO Bank in Amsterdam. Moved to head office to work in the investment bank, worked in Amsterdam, London, New York, retired, moved to Nashville for quality of life, and have been doing mentoring and angel investing for about the last 10 years. And I've done it kind of in every form of through angel groups, through individual companies, and through funds. Most of what I do, mentoring, is helping with fundraising, pitching, poking holes in business plans, etc. So evaluating companies.
Awesome. Thanks, Yvonne. And she has also worked intensively with the Entrepreneur Center in the past and has been one of the most active advisors at different times here at the EC. So grateful to have you here. Chris Sloan, I'm going in the order of the pictures on my screen. Could you introduce yourself, sir?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I lead the emerging companies team for Baker Donelson. That's our group of attorneys that focuses on entrepreneurs and in their businesses, particularly businesses that are trying to scale. And we work with companies all the way through that spectrum from idea stage to an exit and all the steps along the way. As part of that, we do lots of transactions and have lots of interactions with companies and their investors. And so I'm sure we'll have some things to talk about on that front. I have been involved in the EC from the beginning. I was part of the group that actually conceived the idea for the EC, and I've been involved as an advisor, as a board member, all along the way. And I'm excited to be here to talk with you all today.
Awesome. Good to have you here, Chris. Shawn?
Hey everybody, this is Shawn Glinter. I am currently the founder and CEO of Pendant Biosciences, which is a biotech startup using polymers for drug delivery with therapeutics. So not to geek out a whole lot with you because we don't have a lot of time, but we take drugs that perhaps are taken multiple times in a given day or sometimes in a week or a month, and we extend those formulations to make those drugs last many, many months without having taken them multiple times a day. If I go back to 2010, when the EC opened up its doors, in some capacity or the other, I've been very involved with the center and in various different capacities. But obviously excited to be back on this panel. I've spent most of my time either starting companies or mentoring and advising first-time founders. So a lot of that in the community and from west to east. And I'm just excited to actually participate on the panel here.
Yeah, it's really good to have Shawn here. Before he left us to run this exciting new business again, Shawn in our first 3 years completed 22% of all of our advisor meetings. So very grateful to Shawn and his legendary kicking us off. Jorge, can you introduce yourself, sir?
Sure, let me unmute myself. So yeah, my name is Jorge Titinger. I'm new to the area. Moved in September to Brentwood, and after 39 years in Silicon Valley. So I've been in tech my whole career. I was a 3-time CEO of, for those who know this company, Silicon Graphics, which was one of the well-known supercomputer companies, and then CEO of 2 semiconductor equipment companies. I'm an angel investor as well, though mostly now I do it through being an LP in a number of funds. And I am also a mentor for startups in a group called Endeavor. That's a global accelerator incubator group. I'm from Peru, and prior to this shutdown thing, I go to Peru every month, where I'm trying to help the startup community there that is truly in its infancy. I coach CEOs. Have a couple of companies that I mentor that are early on startups, and I'm recently met with Jane and to see how I can get involved with the EC, and whether it's helping startups, mentoring companies, connecting West Coast money to this area, etc. So looking forward to meeting all of you and working with you.
Yeah, a recent connection to us here at the EC, which we're really grateful for, and part of a large influx that we've seen of people coming to Nashville from out of town. So very grateful to have you here, Jorge. Welcome to the community. Joshua, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name's Josh Mullen. I'm a shareholder at Baker Donelson, law partners with Chris Sloan. I do a lot of government contracts work, so I assist government contractors across the board, from early stage companies to large companies, with a variety of different things, including regulatory compliance, bid protests, disputes. And then outside of that, I also do a lot of commercial disputes. One thing that's kept me very busy in the last couple weeks, as you might imagine, is the SBA loan program. and in particular the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program, and then the economic injury disaster loans. So I'm really glad to be here today. Looking forward to hearing what others have to say and contributing as well.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you here too. So our stated topic today was how to leverage your board, your investment attorney, and your investors in this time to be successful. And there touches on a lot of different things. And so I'd like to start in the area of boards and advisory boards. And I was going to throw it to Chris or Josh. If either of you could kick us off just by helping us distinguish what we're talking about. So the difference between a advisory board or a board of directors.
Yeah, sure. I'll field that one. So the primary difference is that a board of directors is a body that every corporation is required to have by statute. And a person who serves as a director of a corporation is in a fiduciary role, meaning that they owe certain statutory duties to the stockholders of the company that are fairly serious things. And if you as a director don't meet your statutory fiduciary obligations, you can actually get in trouble for that. But generally speaking, governance in a corporation flows from the shareholders to the board to the officers. So the shareholders own the corporation. They elect the board of directors. The board of directors is the general strategy, policy, and major decision-making body in a corporation. They will appoint the officers, the president, and so on, who then are responsible for implementing what the board decides on a day-to-day basis. An advisory board, on the other hand, is not a formal thing in the sense that there is no statute in the state or federal laws that creates or even authorizes an advisory board. And then really what it means for most companies is it is an informal panel of people who have agreed to share their experience or connections with you on an as-needed basis. It's not a fiduciary role. It typically is not compensated, at least in the early stage companies, other than with a small percentage of equity. Correspondingly, there's not typically much of a time commitment that goes along with it. It's, an ad hoc kind of deal. They rarely meet as an actual board, but they agree basically that they're going to take your call and give you advice when you need it and be available to help on an as-needed basis. But you don't really have to do anything formal to create an advisory board. There's for startups, there's really no such thing as bylaws for an advisory board, mainly because they don't have any official decision-making capacity. They are exactly what the name suggests. They are people there to advise.
So thank you, Chris. And I know many of our panelists play both. Jorge, do you have something to kick in there?
Yeah, just clarify, right? So what Chris says is spot on. That's for public companies, right? I mean, private startups it's not mandatory to have a board of directors.
It is for if the form of your company is a corporation, you are actually required to have a board of directors, even if it's only one person. If you're an LLC, it's a different deal. I mean, LLCs are much more flexible. You're not required to have a board. So in small companies, it may be a bit of a formality, but you are actually required to have a board.
Thanks.
Awesome. So if we kind of take this by stage like entrepreneurs would, the early stage entrepreneur is still probably setting up a board of directors. So let's say they have an advisory board. How can they engage them to have an effective relationship in general? And then what should they do in this time in particular, or make sure that they still do to manage those relationships? And I'd open that to the floor. I know that several of you on this call are both or have been the entrepreneur with the advisory board and are on advisory boards for entrepreneurs.
I'll jump in. So I've been on several advisory boards, and the beauty of an advisory board is that you get a wide variety of opinions in different areas. The ones that I think have been the most successful are ones that have contained people from various skill sets. And so when you're having conversations about something they want to do, a pivot or a change in product, a change in marketing or whatever, by having people with different skill sets, you get the 360 view of the impact that would make. Instead of just looking at it from a financial perspective or a marketing perspective, you get the full perspective. So they also kind of help the founders get out of their echo chamber, in that they can be very blunt and honest with them. Unlike a board of directors where sometimes the CEOs might want to be impressing them and not letting them know the bad news. An advisory board is total truthfulness. Not that the board of directors is not, but there's nobody to impress. There's nobody that you're trying to win over your side or whatever. And again, I think it provides a really deep way of getting a lot of varying opinions before you make a decision.
Thanks, Yvonne. Shawn or Jorge, did you have anything that you might add to recommend on that?
So, I mean, assuming you kind of already have an advisory board in place, or, you know, whether or not you have a board of directors, I mean, certainly, you know, with my current startup, obviously I have both an advisory group as well as a formal board of directors. And I sit on a handful of advisory boards and BODs. So, you know, I think, you know, even before we encountered COVID, I always used to tell entrepreneurs, especially early stage, you have to make your advisory boards work with you and work for you, not against you. And I think it's important, you know, also to, you know, a lot of times is certainly first time founders, we are looking for people that have experience, have knowledge, are smarter than us, hopefully, and just can share, you know, years of experience. But a lot of times we seek individuals that have answers or know stuff that we don't know, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are the right people, and do they have the right answers? So obviously, knowing that some of these advisory boards are currently in place, as well as, you know, I'm trying to just, you know, speak between, you know, the board of directors and the advisory boards, but just specifically on advisory boards right now, I think what you're trying to do is you're trying to leverage, you know, individuals' experience, and obviously, you know, some individuals will have decades of experience and knowledge, just by the chronological age. I think, you know, one of the things to consider right now is that there is not a very easy way to distinguish between what's going on in people's personal lives and whether it be our startup lives, our corporate lives, just, you know, our professional lives, and more right now, I'm certainly finding entrepreneurs that are really they're very needy right now. And again, I'm just kind of speaking around the advisory boards right now, because a lot of times entrepreneurs will have a dozen, you know, advisors on an advisory board. It's not, you know, it's not like they have a dozen or more on their board of directors. Usually they should not, but they're just wanting to talk. They're panicked. They're trying to figure stuff out. They don't have answers to things. But I think one of the challenges is that there's a high degree of need right now. At the same time, I feel the same need to go ahead and, you know, leverage some of my advisors, and then, you know, even the board. And I think, you know, the board is functioning very differently right now than the advisory boards, because I think, you know, when you think about a board of directors and there's a fiduciary responsibility, and if I speak from my own experience right now with Pendant, my board, it's been a lot of very significantly serious conversations about the company and the trajectory of the company and the activity that, you know, was happening prior to COVID. It's a little looser with advisory boards, right? I mean, there isn't a fiduciary responsibility. There isn't necessarily people holding you as accountable, even though I think advisory boards, if you're going to sit on them, you should be accountable to one another. But it's just a very different conversation. And I think expectations are different. I think there is, in some cases, depending if your board of directors have institutional investors on them, you know, there is just a lot more that we're trying to, you know, kind of address, and there are different needs. So one of the things that I would encourage, you know, anybody that's trying to leverage their advisory board or their board, now is not the time not to communicate, right? And now is not the time to, you know, figure, you know, about let's go crawl in a hole and we won't address. I mean, and that includes speaking to your shareholders, your investors. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to communicate every week, but, you know, you need to also leverage their experience. And it doesn't mean that you should, you know, you have to have all the answers on how to communicate to your investors. And, you know, many boards, in fact, you know, I've never experienced something like this in my lifetime. And I would suspect many of you haven't either. And so, it's okay. Boards are trying to figure this out, whether they're made up of investors, whether they are just independents or what have you. Leverage, those that have experience, and you're trying to figure stuff out. So I guess not going on any longer other than just saying you got to be patient, right? You got to be patient.
If I may add, one thing to remember though, because I think, a lot of times people get advisors that are competent in very specific domains, right? So if you need financial help, you'll get somebody who's competent in finance. If you need R&D help, you'll get somebody who's competent in development. And remember that competence is domain specific, right? So be careful who you ask for what advice. We unfortunately are trained in the West to listen to football players talk to us about investments on TV, right? And we believe that we should listen to them. Don't listen to them about football, not investments. So it's the same thing with your advisory board. Be very conscientious about what is it that you're asking for advice from them, and ensure that these are people who actually do have some level of expertise in that particular domain. Like Shawn said, communicate. I'm on 5 public boards. Anywhere from like 400 or 500 million in revenues to 3 billion in revenues, and every one of them is meeting weekly now. And it's just for updates. It's just for, in case an executive or the company has a question, or, many of these, one of the reasons to have these advisory boards and board of directors is also to leverage the networks of those folks. So there's a reasonable chance that somebody may have seen an issue similar to the one that you're looking at in that extended network. So leverage that. Don't be shy to ask, but make sure that you ask the right people.
Jorge, I don't know if you were looking at the chat box too, but you danced right into a question someone had asked, which was, could you dive into the unique angles of advisors who are physicians? And before, we don't have to go into too much detail on that, but I think some of what Jorge probably said applies, but I'd open it up to you all, and Jorge first.
Well, I'm not from the medical world, other than I'm on a board of a hospital, but we have half the board is RMDs and the other half are business folks. And my side cares about the business of the hospital rather than the medical practice. Mm-hmm. But I mean, generically, the advice holds, right? So if it is, if you're in a healthcare or a medical company, leverage the physicians for their knowledge about the product or the offer or the service. And if you have business people on your advisory board or your board, leverage them from the business perspective, the money perspective. And now you might have somebody who's really competent on both, which would be great. But my point is, we unfortunately tend to forget that competence is domain specific.
Yeah. Another entrepreneur asked, how much weight do VCs give to an advisory board when pitching? And I might also open that to how much weight do individual angels give to when they look at an advisory board and are seeing an entrepreneur come across their desk?
I'll give you a couple of thoughts on that. The sum is the answer. I mean, how much is going to vary depending on who the advisors are. I mean, I have seen companies that have asked people to join their advisory board because there's a prestige factor associated with that person in the relevant industry or in the relevant skill set. And so having that person being willing to have their name associated with a company has value that an investor would understand and appreciate. It's certainly nowhere near as important as the founding team from the standpoint of a VC in most cases. The only thing I'll add, this is a small trap that I sometimes see companies fall into, is if you have somebody on your advisory board or frankly on your fiduciary board who is known to be an active investor, and they haven't invested in your company or committed to invest in your company, that can be a red flag. It's certainly the sort of thing that if a VC or an investor looks at your advisory board and sees somebody who's known to them to be an active investor, they may ask, well, how much has that person put in? If the answer is none and they haven't committed to put any in, it's very natural for the investor, the potential investor, to think, well, that person knows a lot more about this company than I do, and they haven't put money in. So there's going to be questions about that. Doesn't mean they have to write a big fat check, but they ought to either put some in or soft circle some that they're willing to put in behind a lead investor down the road.
Mm-hmm. Shawn or Yvonne, any other
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so it depends on when you're raising money, right? From venture. I mean, I think you know, if you're raising money, you know, from venture, and this is your second or third raise, I mean, you obviously are going to have a board in place, and certainly, you know, that board, you know, they may be all rock stars, and at the same time, you know, it's also important to realize that if you have board members that are problematic, right? I mean, a lot of times VCs don't like to inherit those, and certainly sometimes those can be challenging for the founders or the CEO, because you have to kind of fix that before you know, that transaction gets done. I think, you know, when I think about kind of the advisory board and again the board, I think one of the and again, one being fiduciary, one not. I think when venture looks at, you know, putting money in, it is important that you have the right people around you, both from strategically, you know, domain experts, subject matter experts with experience, but also the team, right? I mean, I think sometimes founders, especially first-time founders, they, without a lot of experience, will think that if they have their advisors or they even have kind of what they think is a board, they also sometimes think that makes up their team, right? So that tends to be a kind of a problematic situation when they use their advisors as their team, and they really don't have that team. So as much as it's important to kind of have advisors, and potentially depending on the stage of financing, that team is really important. So I'd probably emphasize, you know, that team and the right team around you and the experience around you with that team. But I don't think that in my experience, whether it's been raising money or helping others raise money and what have you with regards to advisory boards or boards, I don't think it's been overweighed in the sense of the amount of weight that goes into the team. So I would really emphasize the team and kind of make sure I have that locked and loaded.
If I may just add one thing. One of the key things when presenting, I'm unmuted, right? Yeah, okay. To VCs or angels or whatnot is, you know, especially for new founders, is to gain credibility, right? I mean, a lot of people will tell you, yeah, what a great idea, but really what they're investing is the team. And so this whole focus on the team is absolutely important. But if your advisory board can get you some borrowed credibility with those investors, it goes a long way. And it might be that they're part of their own network. And so I'm sure people have heard the concept of smart money, right? And so they will view, especially, and you know what Chris said, if your advisors haven't invested, danger, right? But if they have, a lot of VCs will view that as smart money and relax a little bit and give you some level of credibility that you may not yet have just because you're new, they don't know you, et cetera, et cetera. But I know people who invest purely on the team if the idea is okay, because they know if that particular one doesn't work, they'll come up with another one that might work. And so focus on, you know, building a really strong team. And like Shawn said, you know, being an advisor, having an advisor, they're not part of the team. They're not, you know, they'll help you, but they're not going to be there every day, right? And so people need, you know, you have to build a really strong team.
John, I'm just going to add one additional thing. One of the mistakes that I see, if you think that you're going to go on to try to get professional money, I see so many of the times where people start out in their angel rounds or their bridge rounds where they will put the person who's written the biggest check on their board of directors. And they may or may not have any knowledge, but they wrote a big check. And that becomes very problematic when you go on to try to raise money, because then it becomes, they don't want that person on the board. They were one of your first biggest investors, and it really puts you in a bad situation. So if you think the goal is to eventually get professional money, you really need to think long and hard about putting people on your board just because they wrote a big check.
I'd like to give what Yvonne said a big old +1. She is completely right about that.
Well, you've been +1, Yvonne. And so as we look at leveraging our advisory boards, one of the questions that I had for you, Josh, is you're kind of going through the world of being up to speed on, as much as anyone can be, on CARES Act, COVID legislation, et cetera. What is it that you're advising entrepreneurs, and what might you be seeing entrepreneurs do to be more successful right now?
Yeah, the CARES Act, it is an ever-changing situation, literally on a daily basis. There's new guidance coming out through frequently asked questions or a new interim rule. And I don't know if you all have heard the news today, but the funding has actually dried up and there's no more funds left in the program, though I fully expect that more will get appropriated and brought to the program. The CARES Act program, I think, is a great potential opportunity for early stage companies or companies across the board to just go out and get funds based upon your payroll and to get through this crisis. It remind me what your initial question was, and I'll come back to it after the introduction there.
So what is it that you're advising business owners to do, or what are you seeing them do as far as good ways to respond to this uncertain environment as legislation keeps changing and they're under stress?
Yeah, I think one particular issue that I think people, especially early stage companies with outside investors, have dealt with over the last couple weeks is what affiliation rules mean. And I won't go into that here just because they can get pretty deep, but one of the significant issues is if a outside investor holds certain control over ordinary actions of the business, day-to-day business actions, creating a budget, hiring, firing, deciding on what type of business to conduct. If they have that negative control, it can impact funding. We've worked on through talking to SBA and through a lot of advocacy across the board through our organizations as well as venture organizations that are out there to try to get some of those rules changed. But I don't right now foresee that they will be changed. And so what can happen to that program? How can people take advantage of that program? Unfortunately, the one opportunity that people have is to have investors give up certain control rights. That is the one way that you can go into this program and be eligible for it, is if you get outside investors to agree that because of the situation, we have kind of two horrible choices. Maybe we're going to go out of business because we need this funding to keep going. But if we keep our control provisions in place, we're not going to be able to get the funding. So giving up some of those control provisions so that you give more leeway to the investors so that they can go out to get funding. That's one way to handle the current situation. I think staying on top of what's available is another thing that investors should be looking to do, because there are new programs coming out. There's been 3 bills that have passed. There's supposed to be a 4th bill. There are a lot of conversations about will there be some technical corrections per se in the 4th bill that will change some of the prior funding mechanisms that have already occurred. And there has been a lot of conversation about the venture capital issues and affiliation rules. And I would say stay on top of that through industry sources, through organizations like yours, sign up for our alerts at Baker Donelson, because we try to keep people pretty informed of when there are significant changes in those areas. Because it's moving so fast, I think there are further opportunities for funding that will come, and staying involved and engaged and looking at what those opportunities are, I think are all good ideas.
Hey, John, I want to just add a couple of points there to what Josh said. The tricky part about the affiliation rules is that, well, it's a little unclear what the SBA or the Congress intended with how these things might apply in circumstances like these. But specifically the issue is that some of the very standard negative voting rights that investors have under a very standard preferred stock type investment are the very things that have been cited in prior case law related to these affiliation rules as creating an affiliate relationship. And just to be, we hadn't stated this, but the significance of someone being an affiliate is you have to include their employees in the count for purposes of determining your eligibility for these Paycheck Protection Program loans and possibly other SBA loans. So if you have a VC who is an affiliate and you have only 100 employees, but all the other funds that are affiliated with that VC have 3,000 employees, then you're going to be way over the total. But the issue is that standard rights that you might give to a VC will trigger this. But it's important to note that what we think is the case is that it has to be a VC has to be able to exercise those rights on their own for them to be an affiliate. So they either have to control the round, they have to have a majority of the rights in the round, or they have to specifically have rights. So in an example where you have a number of investors, but none of them have a majority of the ownership of a particular round, and none of those investors have rights specific to them to veto, we think in those cases, those VCs are not an affiliate. I emphasize we think because, as Josh said, we're still trying to figure this out fairly quickly with very limited guidance from the SBA, but that's what we think is the situation right now.
Uh-oh. I'm realizing that John is not here any longer.
We lost Murdock.
This is not something I've had happen before. Where is John? Wow. I actually don't really know what to do in this exact situation.
Haley, I feel like you brought this on us when you made your comment about technical problems earlier.
I know. I was like, I've been running everything so smoothly, no issues yet. And now John, well, okay. Yvonne, you sent me a lot of questions. Is there something that you think that you could ask the panelists?
I'll do an impromptu.
Thank you, because I'm too nervous right now to come up with anything.
No, I guess the question would be that one of the things right now, everybody has had what they thought was going to be their product, what they thought was going to be their client base, et cetera. So I guess this goes, well, for anybody, but especially anybody who's in the entrepreneurial world right now, which is how do you know whether to stick status quo or whether you need to pivot because of this? Is this going to be a long-term game changer, or is this something you just have to sweat it out for 6 months or a year?
I'll comment. I think if you start thinking on the other side of this pandemic issue, I think there's going to be certain industries that are going to recover quickly. I think there's going to be some that are going to recover very, very, very slowly, and some that might not. So if you're in one of those that is either very, very slowly or not, you need to rethink what you're doing, right? So coming up with another service that will be to no market is not really interesting. But there's, and I tell this to a number of the entrepreneurs that I'm coaching, is that it's a great thing to be in private equity right now, right? To some extent, if you have a really good business plan and you are executing and you're still in the area of developing your service or your product offer, what's going on in the public markets doesn't really affect you. I mean, other than access to money, compared to being invested heavily in Wall Street, where you're down 30-40% unless you were so brilliant that you picked the stocks that didn't get affected that much. So I would say, it depends. Unfortunately, that answer nobody likes, right? It depends on what your industry is, on what you see, not now, but the future, 1 year out, et cetera, and whether you need to actually, go pedal to the metal or pivot. The one thing that I will say that a lot of people don't think about is, and this happened in Silicon Valley in the 2008, 2009 crisis, was the access to talent that would normally not be available for startups was plentiful, because people were really good people were getting laid off of big companies just because the business wasn't there. And people could hire, people who normally you had to compete with, Google and Amazon and Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden in 2009, you didn't. So there were the largest number of new startups came about in those years, and the movement of phenomenal talent to the startup environment compared to established companies. So I don't know what it's like here, but I've got to believe there's really good talent that all of a sudden is available or looking. So it's an opportunity to upgrade your team or to fill in the holes with people that you might have thought you would never get.
I can ask a question unless someone else wanted to add something. All right, crowdsourced. Thinking about kind of current times, how do you engage investors in conversations about perhaps changing their current rights to help the company survive in a downturn? Also, John is back.
So this is going back to the affiliation issue. And the short answer is that if the important thing to note is that if you're going to amend your investment documents to remove the affiliation of a VC, and the VC is willing to do it, it has to be intended to be permanent at that point. You can't have an under the table or side agreement that as soon as the loan is forgiven, you're going to put those rights back in place. The SBA has made it clear from guidance that won't fly. It has to be, quote, irrevocable. So the intent has to be that those changes are going to stay in place until there's a business reason that they shouldn't. Now, if the loan gets forgiven and then they go raise another round of VC at that point that might have those same rights, different issue. But you can't have an intention with your current investors to only waive those rights for purposes of the PPP loan program.
Yeah, and I'll jump on that too. When you're applying for an SBA loan or you're certifying for any government program, even if you're a business that intends to do government contracts, when you sign up for that program, you're certifying eligibility. You're saying an affirmative statement to the government that I comply. And that's been one of the difficulties with the affiliation rules. I actually deal with the affiliation rules all the time on the government contract side. But now these rules have been, a $350 billion loan program has been dropped on top of these rules that just a lot of people had no reason to care about before. And now we're looking at these complicated venture capital provisions and operating agreements and trying to figure out what to do with them so that people can survive. As to your question about whether or how to go to an investor to have these conversations, I think the reality is just a lot of it depends upon the condition of your company when you're having those conversations. I've had a lot of those type of conversations in the last couple of weeks where talking to people about it's kind of either they get funding or they're going to have to lay off everyone, or there's going to be just shutting the doors. And those are difficult conversations to have, but those are also those real facts when you're talking to investors about, look, this is an opportunity for funding for a 2-month period to get us through this crisis. But understanding you have to give up some rights for us to do that. But if you don't give them up, we may not be here in 2 months, I think, is some of the conversations that are going on.
And so to that end, if there are things that we have to be honest and forthright and be committed to the actions that we're going to take as an entrepreneur. I imagine that we have a lot of entrepreneurs that are hitting this difficult time and wondering, or if they're not, maybe they should be, what's the right way to have those difficult discussions with an advisor whom they wanted to continue to think positively about their business, or maybe become an investor, an angel investor that they wanted to reinvest later down the road or help them find more investment, or the VC or fund that had already invested in them. And now they're saying, wow, I'm in trouble and I'm not hitting my goals. And we've heard reference to some people calling in panics or having more meetings or more discussions. How should an entrepreneur try to present themselves in this situation in the right light that's going to help them reach their goals? And I open that to everybody. I know you're all dealing with it right now from different ends.
Yeah, I can follow up on that just with people that I've been talking to that have been having these type of conversations. I think if we're all honest, and maybe a lot of people here are a lot smarter than I am, but if we went a month and a half ago, no one really saw where we are right now. Very few people saw where we were going to be right now, with businesses across the board shutting down, and all of us, instead of sitting at the Entrepreneur Center, doing this by Zoom and et cetera. So having a investor or having a company founder go to an investor or to their board, et cetera, and just explaining detailed facts of how we truly now have an unprecedented situation that we didn't really see, we couldn't have really foreseen, we couldn't have really prepared for from a business perspective. And we're in this situation. So what's the best way? What's our plan to get through it? I think it's going through and identifying a clear step-by-step plan of where we are now and where we can be if we all kind of come to the table and cooperate on this process, and then where we likely will be if we don't do that. And that's in particular with the affiliation conversations or anything else about funding, difficult employment decisions across the board. What's our plan? What's our step-by-step plan to get through this process?
Yvonne, I saw you had some thoughts too.
Yes. This one really, if I had to say, was my biggest bugaboo, is communication during a downtime. You would be surprised at how few startup companies I'm invested in I've heard from. The ones that are keeping me posted they have no idea what a great job that they're doing at that, because guess where the first place, if you really get in a deep, dark place and you're potentially going to have some kind of a bridge to even make payroll, for example, where do you think that money's going to come from? Your best bet is to go back to your existing investors. They know you, they believed in you once, they will still believe in you now, probably, unless your product is totally not relevant anymore. But by not communicating with them and then coming back to them to ask for more money, it doesn't go well. And so I can't stress, even if it's good news, bad news, or just in a holding pattern news, you need to keep your investors informed about what you're doing, because those are the most likely people to reinvest in you right now.
We saw that we had a question on what was the appropriate size of the board, or what we should think through as we consider that. Chris, did you have a thought on that?
Not other than what's already been shared.
Cool. And then what if you have an angel investor and elect to utilize crowdsourcing to obtain your capital? How would that affect obtaining future VC or angel dollars?
So I do have some thoughts on that one. So understand we're talking about equity-based crowdfunding, I assume. Obviously, there's no issue if you're doing non-equity-based crowdfunding like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, that sort of thing. First thing to remember is that there's still fairly limited options for how you go about doing it. The concern that institutional investors have will be dealing with a large number of small and potentially unsophisticated investors and investing behind them. Even more so if they're potentially unaccredited investors under one of the crowdfunding exemptions. The perception has been that a large number of investors, and particularly small and unsophisticated investors, significantly increases the risk of a shareholder dispute down the road. So you have to be cognizant of that if you decide to go down the crowdfunding path that might lead to a large number of small, unsophisticated investors. Now, there are crowdfunding portals out there that are designed for dealing with only accredited investors and larger investment sizes that really are just sort of a proxy for a typical angel round. And I'm not talking about that sort of thing. I have always held the opinion that the broad-based, equity-based crowdfunding tools work best for one-shot deals, for companies that need an early infusion of capital to get off the ground, but aren't likely to need to raise additional equity capital going forward. I think companies that are going to need to go out into the institutional market are taking a real risk if they use a crowdfunding tool for the large number of small investors.
Hey, John, I'd like to speak to communication because I saw another question come up.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would tell everyone that currently, you know, is a CEO of a startup. I mean, obviously, you know, this is going to depend on how many investors you have, what have you. But I have reached out to every shareholder of Pendant. I chose not to just send an email, but I have called every one of my investors. Now, I have not talked to everyone because not everybody has called me back for, you know, any various reasons. Some are just dealing with other stuff. But, you know, as Yvonne, as you talk about communication and what have you, you know, I unfortunately don't have great news as it relates to the current status of Pendant because we came to a screeching halt on our R&D operations. And, you know, we have two big pharma partnerships and collaborations that are ongoing, but due to the kind of the inability to kind of conduct R&D right now, those have just come to a screeching halt. I did not call my investors asking for money, although some that was the first question out of some of their mouths. And Shawn, hey, we haven't talked in a year because some of them don't want to talk to me anymore because they just wrote their checks and they're like, don't worry, you can give me your update via email. But those that do talk to me on a regular basis, I actually talk frequently to. But a lot just thought I was calling to, you know, ask for money. And it was more of just, I just want to tell you where we are and what's going on and what my plan is and how the team is doing and kind of the lay of the land. So I realize email is easy because you can send it out to your list of 350 people that are friends of the company as well. But pick up the phone and call them or schedule a call. It's a one-on-one. You have an intimate relationship and connection with each of those investors, especially if they're early angels. If you haven't talked to your venture, I'd be shocked by now, but certainly your angels and those early believers in you and your team, you should be talking to them.
So Shawn, you know, bring up a good point in that you're also in it, like many of the entrepreneurs in the audience and the people that will be watching this, going through the experience of running a business and being significantly affected by this current pandemic. So can you give us any insight that you could share into what you are doing or how you're handling it beyond just talking to advisors, but like what do you do when your lab's shut down?
Right. So first and foremost, I have to share that I'm currently getting through this bottle. Okay.
Fair.
That's
as your lawyer, I endorse that approach.
So that's my current bottle of 18-year-old single malt Scotch. But so again, your question is, what do you do now in this kind of this limbo?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, for Pendant, specifically, and I think some of it applies to others, obviously not just to Pendant, but so my R&D operations came to a screeching halt. I also had a $1.1 million hard circled in bridge money. And we were literally getting ready to, execute documents and, start collecting money. That took me about a month and a half to really circle up. And in about 4 days, it all kind of got put on hold. I've never had so many people put that on hold so quickly. I mean, it literally just happened kind of like this. Now, the good news is that it's not all just gone, right? So I had a couple people that say, I'm just not going to invest right now. But I'd say about 90% of that, that money is still soft circled, at some point. What does that mean? I don't know. Obviously, if you've had to shut down and you're not able to operate, I think your team is really important. And I have a virtual team. I mean, I've got people all over the world. As well as, not just here in the US. So one of the things is just communicating with my team, staying engaged with my team, whether it's, I talk to everyone at least once a week. We try to get on a call, although there's been some challenges, obviously, just because not everybody's been able to get on a call. But some of it is just trying to go ahead and be there for my team and be supportive because we're not operating right now, right? And we have a plan and we know what we need to do once we kind of can pick up some momentum, but I also don't have control on a lot of this stuff. So I'm also just trying to, encourage you got to focus on what you can control. And I don't think now is the time to, have a major pivot and start becoming something that you're not. I mean, if your startup is actively operating in somewhere that in a space, in an industry that you can, have utility and you can be certainly productive in dealing with the COVID crisis. So essentially, also, if you're a healthcare company that has something that is relevant. But I don't think now's the time to try to go ahead and start something, with your company that you're just not, that isn't in your wheelhouse. Obviously, if you're continuing to operate and you're able to, I have a handful of entrepreneurs that have software companies and they're doing stuff, not just in healthcare. I mean, they're plugging along. I mean, because their whole team works, virtual and remote. And so they haven't really shut down. Whether you're operating or not, I think one of the best things you can do right now is to communicate with your team, right? Stay engaged with your team, be supportive to your team. And the other reality is, one of my younger scientists said to me the other day, Shawn, are you worried? And, the worst thing I could do is lie to him, right? And I will tell you that this is a scary time because there's just a lot of things I don't know. I mean, do I believe that we are going to come out on, on the good end here? Yeah, I do. Right. I mean, both thinking medically and scientifically, I can tell you, the confidence that I have, but I don't have a lot of answers right now. And so some of it is just this individual's anxiety and agitation around the current situation that I just needed to kind of talk him down off the ledge a little bit. Because, he was terribly concerned and just very, he was not in a good place. So it's really important, to touch base with your team and communicate with them more frequently.
Thank you for sharing that. Jorge, I know in your background, one of your many experiences was leading a very large successful turnaround, and it's definitely a different set of circumstances, but I was wondering if there were things you've learned from that situation that might translate to today or to the experiences that you're going through today with the entrepreneurs you advise and invest in.
Yeah, I think the biggest relevant thing is that you have to maintain flexibility, right? And be nimble. And this is partly why ongoing regular communication is so important, is because you don't want to miss an opportunity to actually not necessarily change what you're doing, but slow certain things down, accelerate others, take advantage of something that may present itself that if you're not talking to people, you won't see. But at the same time, I think many companies are facing what for some is going to be purely an economic question, which is, well, I'm not making money and I have all these expenses in payroll and I'm going to get rid of those expenses. And for others, it's truly an ethical question of how do you actually ensure, especially if you have an optimistic view of the future, that when we come out of this, you will have a team, right? So what I've seen is, and I think a lot of it truly depends on the leadership and the board, but in the end, you know, the CEO sets the tone for culture. And I think that question is a question of culture, and culture is so important in times of crises, right? I have a probably foolish saying that says, you know, culture will eat strategy for lunch. I've seen many great strategies not work because the culture of the company was terrible, right? And I've seen mediocre strategies kind of get better over time because you have a really valuable, powerful culture. So I would invest, if I were a founder or in the senior team of a startup, on maintaining the right type of culture and mood. And I know mood is a funny word when we're talking about business, but the reality is that mood is contagious. And if you're the leader, your mood will be contagious, right? So if you're in a crappy mood, everybody will get bummed out and you're going to have a terrible time. And versus, you know, having, yeah, not an irresponsibly, you know, happy-go-lucky mood, but, you know, centered in reality, creative. You know, bad moods also completely stall creativity, and you need people to be at their best. So put an effort into maintaining the right mood, the right culture. Personally, I definitely lean towards take care of people. And if you're able to do that and get through this crisis, you will have a very committed team when times are better, compared to just slash because of your income statement. But, you know, the reality is there's companies who can't afford to do that. So it's, you know, I've, not by choice, but I led 3 turnarounds. My 3 CEO experiences were all turnarounds, and you know, I'll say it again. I think it's about the people. So focus on that.
Yeah. So very grateful to our panelists today. I know we promised that we would get you out of here by 2. It's 2:02, so I broke my promise. I blame my technical difficulties and apologize for those. I know y'all had other meetings to get to, so you are free to depart. If we could all applaud. A thank you to all of you for coming in and speaking. Chris, Joshua, Yvonne, Shawn, Jorge. Heard a lot of really great info on here. We'll have this available to be listened to following up. We'll send it out via, I believe, email. And then we'll be able to utilize it with our other program participants. Darren, I see you have a question, so we'll try to follow up with that after this, if you still have it. And I wanted to throw it to Jane or Zap if you had anything you wanted to throw in before we depart.
Nope. Hardest thing about these virtual events is that there is no applause. So we can only imagine it in our heads. But again, thank you so much. I'll get the YouTube link out to all of our panelists and everyone else, hopefully by this afternoon.
Cool.
Yes,
All
and
right.
thank everybody. This was fabulous. I learned information, and so I really appreciate it personally, as well as on behalf of the EC. We really do appreciate you all giving us your time and your expertise. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Together.
Thank you. Thank you.